The war is in an unknown, we don't know the outcome of the war. It's in a very, very dangerous and precarious state.
Now, let's take a look at politics from further afield. And this week, we're going to talk about Ukraine. In news none of us wanted to hear back in February, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russia Ukrainian war. In some ways, it's quite startling how quickly a war in Europe has become part of everyday life.
Many Britons, of course, went above and beyond to offer whatever help they could to Ukraine, whether that was by marching in the streets, welcoming refugees into their homes, and some even crossed the border into Ukraine to offer military assistance to the front line. One of them is Dave Young, who is the subject of a film by the Times' Anthony Lloyd. Anthony Lloyd, of course, has been covering the conflict in Ukraine throughout this year, and he joins us now. Anthony, thank you very much for being with us.
Hello.
Tell us a little about your film with Dave Young.
So, Dave Young was a man that I met earlier this year, shortly after the invasion began in the east, in Donbass. And he's been living actually in Ukraine for 16 years. So he's somebody who's got a great sense of the community there, and he felt quite indebted when the invasion began to do something. And what he chose to do was to start driving special missions to evacuate or rescue civilians from areas directly affected by the fighting. And I went out with him on a couple of these missions earlier this year, one in a city called Severodonetsk, which was under a big Russian attack. In fact, the Russians ended up capturing the city, where Dave was rescuing some people there, some Ukrainians, to bring them further west in the country to safety. And then later in another city called Kupiansk. He works for a charity organization in Ukraine called Help People. And in essence, he's given his missions in the evening to drive. He's based out in the east, to drive the next day, sometimes delivering emergency rations to areas affected directly by the fighting, but often too to evacuate people from specific addresses, either at their request or, if there are no phone links, as so often there aren't now, at the request of relatives who live elsewhere. So he works in extreme risk areas.
Do you think Ukraine and the people of Ukraine can go on surviving the level of destruction and attack which they're getting from Russia, whatever their determination, if they're losing power, electricity, telecommunications, as you say?
I think the war is in a very, very perilous state. I think Ukraine's fortunes in the war are far more under question than perhaps many people here realize. That is not to say that their cause isn't good. It is. They fight on the side of justice and right to defend their sovereign territory. However, that said, and also acknowledging the many big victories they had, they drove the Russians away from Kyiv early on in the invasion, and their counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkiv secured them back a lot of territory. However, we have to realize a number of things. The effects on the power grid are having a huge impact. They're having a huge impact on not just the civil infrastructure, but also on the military's efforts as well. And soldiers fighting on the front line who now are worrying about their relatives too. And you can imagine the disruption that no power has to everything. I mean, from as simple as, hospitals, old people's homes, everything. It's affecting everybody there. But also, we've got to look. I mean, there are a number of comments made by Ukraine's top general who's commanding the operations there, General Zaluzhny, last week in The Economist. And he was very clear and gave a very stark portrayal of the future of the war. He was concerned by the 300,000 fresh troops, the mobilized troops brought to the fronts by the Russians. He did not discount them as underarmed and ineffective. I mean, when the Tsar says march, Russians march. He was very concerned of another land grab, a land attack towards Kyiv by Russian forces ahead of the spring this year. He was very concerned by the attacks on the power grid. And he clearly was open-minded to what the ultimate outcome of the war must be. Now, I think it's very important that people realize quite how grave the situation is at the moment, that they realize the savage nature of fighting around Bakhmut, the city in the east, where thousands and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and wounded in the last couple of months, thousands and thousands of Russians too, I may add, in this huge attritional battle. The war is in an we don't know the outcome of the war. It's in a very, very dangerous and precarious state.
You worked and reported brilliantly from many war zones. Did you ever think that you would see a war of this scale and this sort of determined destruction and inhumanity from Russia on European soil again?
Well, I'd seen some bad stuff done on European soil. I mean, genocide in Bosnia, for one, a different type of war. But I mean, I was surprised to see genocide in Europe after the Second World War, and that's what happened in Srebrenica. I had seen Russia at war twice before in both Chechen wars. Now, Chechnya was much smaller, but the level of destruction there, the immensity of it, but also some lessons which I think I could extract from Chechnya and apply later to Ukraine. Admittedly, I didn't think the war would happen in Ukraine, but clearly it has. In Chechnya, both starts of both wars there, the Russians bungled our initial invasion. They suffered huge casualties, and they looked to be an army in disarray and internal discord. On both occasions, they recollected themselves, they learnt their lessons, and then they reapplied themselves to the fight with an awful lot of people and an awful lot of artillery. That is what is happening in Ukraine now. General Zaluzhny was quite clear as to how his Russian opponents see the war in Ukraine. They see it as a struggle now of years. They were going for the quick grab at the beginning. They didn't get that. They now see that war as a struggle of years.
And can Ukraine, with the level of support it's getting from the West, and perhaps that level of support being questioned in some quarters, can Ukraine sustain that, or will it simply be a question of Russian might and brutality prevailing over a smaller nation?
There is a chance that the forces of darkness will prevail, so to speak, that the forces of, Russian might could prevail. I think the public, perhaps in Britain, got overly hooked on the Ukrainians' gallantry and their earlier victories in this war, which were extremely significant and vital in holding the Russians back. But I think we're entering a new phase now, and as I say, a very perilous phase for Ukraine. The issue of support is key. If Ukraine doesn't have enough support, it will fold and fail, certainly in the east. If it has just enough support, then the war will go on for a long time into an attritional battle of many, many more thousands lost on both sides. And yet, if Ukraine perhaps has too much support, that could then broaden the conflict into an outright confrontation between NATO and Russia, which everyone's seeking to try and avoid. So the careful calibration of supplying Ukraine with enough munitions, particularly artillery shells, to be able to not just hold off Russia, but drive them back without precipitating a wider scale conflict with the West, is the one that's the real act to juggle here. And it's a difficult one to achieve. But I don't want anyone listening to be left under any illusion as to quite how problematic the situation is that Ukraine faces at the moment.
And where can everyone see your film about Dave Young?
The film about Dave Young, Another Man's War, is online. They can see it both on the Times site if they're a subscriber, but if they're not, they can also see it on YouTube just by looking up Another Man's War. Very interesting character, very complex guy, motivated by a different strata of reasons, primarily for his affection of Ukraine, but and someone who has suffered, hugely during his work as well. He's lost his right eye to shrapnel on a rescue mission, and still keeps doing it. Really, really enigmatic character. It's a great privilege to be able to work with him.
Anthony Lloyd, thank you for joining us this afternoon.